I'm a geologist by background, and my wife and co-author on this book that I'll be talking about today is a biologist. And so part of what I want to get across is why would people like us who are trained to study in the more traditional natural history disciplines of things we can actually pick up and look at and see and feel for ourselves, why would we write a book about microbes? Why would Ann and I write a book about microbes? And this was very much a collaborative effort, as you'll see as I try and go through what it is that we learned along the way. And the real message is that the way that we understand the microbial world is really going through a revolution in thought that Ann and I think is really akin to a genuine, bona fide scientific revolution. The way that we are thinking about how microbial communities now interact with plants and with people and are essential to their health and well-being is completely shifting the way that we've thought about and looked at how we interact with the microbial world in ways that has fundamental implications, we argue, for both agriculture and medicine that relate to the themes that you all in this group are very interested in terms of the application of broad-spectrum biocides as routine measures in both agriculture and medicine. There's a big-scale change in the way that we think about our relationship to nature that's going on that's centered in the microbial world and the microscopic world. Now, the title of the book, The Hidden Half of Nature, is actually meant to be taken literally. Because if we look at the range of scales in the way that a geologist, we like sort of logarithmic scales, factors of 10 across things. So from down here at the nanometer scale of DNA up to our scale at the meter scale that we live in, each of these is a jump in a size of a factor of 10. And you'll notice where the boundary between the microscopic world, the invisible world, and the visible world lies. It's halfway through the scale. There's as much of a range in size in the microscopic world of nature as there is in the world of nature that we know from the size of amoebas up to us. And if you actually weighed up all the microbes on this planet and you compared that to the weight of all the plants and animals on this planet, they're about equal. And there's about a nonillion microbes on this planet. Now, anybody know how big a nonillion is? I didn't. I had to look it up. It's a 1 followed by 30 zeros. That's a lot of zeros. How many zeros is that? That's enough that if you took all the bacteria, all the microbes in the world, and laid them end to end, and it takes 50,000 of them to go around just my thumb, if you laid them all end to end, they would reach the nearest star and back. And I'm not talking about Sol, our star. I'm talking about Alpha Centauri and back. In other words, microbes, if they ever got organized, could actually get off this planet before we could. So, how is it that we came to actually recognize and get interested in and look at this microscopic world? Well, it may seem like a bit of a non sequitur, but we bought a house in Seattle. And if that is, well, basically, it came with a lawn, an old-growth Seattle lawn. It was a lawn planted in 1918. Nothing much had been grown there after that. I thought it was actually a perfectly fine lawn. The dog liked to chase balls on it. I could get the grad students over for croquet once a year. But my wife is a gardener and viewed this as her garden to be. And it's one of the main reasons we bought this house, is that she wanted to actually transform it from something other than that lawn. And so when we pulled off that lawn, we discovered that we actually had this incredibly rich, dark, fertile soil. Oh, no. We had glacial till. But what was really happening? What happened? Why was this organic matter crusade? Why was adding dead material, essentially, to the surface of the soil, leading to an explosion of life both above and below ground that we describe in much more detail in the book than I'll have time to go into today, because there's a whole second half of the talk that I want to get to. But basically, that compost that we were adding at the surface was being consumed by microbes, bacteria and fungi, the sort of the smallest creatures in the soil food web, which were then being in turn consumed by larger creatures, which are consumed by larger creatures. And we were cycling organic matter into this underground ecosystem in ways that led us to learn things that frankly quite surprised us and started us on this view of a completely different relationship of the natural world to human societies. So when you think about what is happening with these small creatures in the soil food web, I like to think of them as tiny livestock that are manuring the soil from the inside out. And when you start thinking that way, you start thinking about, oh, well, by adding all that organic matter to the yard, we're basically feeding our grazing animals that are then in turn being grazed on, sort of a two-step soil food web, and that was essentially building up the nutrient levels in the soil. But it turns out the plants actually push out into their soil up to 30 or 40% of the carbon and the carbon-rich compounds that they can manufacture with their monopoly on photosynthesis. They'll push that stuff out of their roots and into the soil. Now, why would a plant do that? How many of you take 30 to 40% of your income and just go throw it on a street corner somewhere? You know, if you think about it in those terms, it's kind of an utterly irrational thing for a plant to do. And yes, I know plants don't have brains, but they do communicate, so we talk about that all day. But what is it? Why would plants be essentially pushing out such nutritious material, what Elaine Ingham likes to call the equivalent of cakes and cookies, into the soil? It's to feed the life that's living in the rhizosphere. And why would a plant do that and maintain that over the entire sort of evolutionary history of plants? Because if you go back and look at the very first plant fossils from 400 million years ago, they have mycorrhizal fungi intertwined with their roots. This has been going on as long as there have been plants. Why would they do that? Well, it's not because most of the microbes are pathogens. That would be an evolutionary dead end. It's because they're basically feeding life forms in the soil that provide benefits to the plants. And I learned to see the rhizosphere, this life-dense zone around the roots of plants, as what we call a biological bazaar, where microbes and plants trade nutrients, metabolites, and exudates. For example, when some insect herbivores snack on your favorite plant or a crop, that plant will push exudates out into the soil that will that are tailored to feeding the growth of very particular microbes or microbial communities that will then produce very particular exudates that are taken back up by the plant and can produce compounds that taste bad to that particular insect. The science is finally catching up with some of the insights of the early pioneers of organic agriculture. What is it that actually supports health, and particularly the human immune system? Because with an event like cancer in your life, you start thinking about, well, what are the things that we could do to really bolster the effectiveness of our immune system to try and make sure we don't have any future episodes along those lines? So while we were thinking that the microbial world was this incredibly symbiotic thing, we got thrown this curveball that reminded us that not all microbes are on our side. There are very bad microbes in this world, and it led us into thinking about the human microbiome and its relationship to our immune system. And this is an area of science that's been exploding. These are just number of publications since 2000 to a couple of years ago. You'll notice an exponential growth curve. It keeps going up. Just the number of papers and interest in the human microbiome has obviously exploded in the last couple of years. And this idea that the regulation of your immune system to quell inflammation is dictated in part by microbes that are living in your gut is a completely new way of looking at the immune system, and it also leads us to a completely new way at thinking about and looking at what we eat. Now, if you look at what has changed over the course of the 20th century in terms of infectious and chronic diseases, there's a relationship here that we're going to try and get at the heart of. If we look at what's happened in terms of infectious diseases since the Second World War, they've really dropped dramatically. And why? Well, obviously antibiotics came into play in that era. Great increases in public sanitation happened in that same era as well. The development of vaccines and their widespread use happened. Infectious diseases have gone through the floor in the last couple human generations. But at the same time, rates of chronic disease have gone through the roof. And this is a hypothesis that's being pursued by many researchers around the world. A lot of the results so far are correlative and have not established causal links. But there's a whole bunch of maladies for which causal links are starting to be established. And every malady up here on the screen is one in which people have hypothesized and demonstrated correlative effects, and some of them have demonstrated causative effects. And I noticed there's an article that came out, I think, a couple days ago where you could add Parkinson's to the list. So what is it that might have happened to our microbiome that could have led to to serious proposals to investigate the idea of very widespread effects? Well, what about what we eat? I mean, we know about changes in antibiotics after the Second World War, and how they might affect the human microbiome shouldn't be much of a mystery. Broad-spectrum antibiotics kill microbes broadly. But what about what we eat? The one message we want to convey is that there are really strong parallels in what's happening in terms of the relationship between the microbial world out in agricultural fields in the garden and within the garden of our own gut. So how does this matter to our own health? Well, I'll try and drive it home here, where if you have all these different fiber sources, of which there's lots of different varieties, lots of different names for, but the basic idea are complex carbohydrates that are coming from whole plant foods. Those get into your colon, they get consumed by the microbiota within your colon, your microbiome, and they then produce their own metabolites. A lot of them produce fatty acids like acetate, butyrate, and propionate. And it turns out, I'm going to focus just on butyrate. Why? Well, what feeds the cells lining your colon wall? Most of our cells in our body are fed by our blood. Our colon lining is mostly fed, it gets most of its energy from the butyrate that's produced by microbes living in your gut. And those microbes depend on a diet of fiber. If they don't get enough butyrate, what happens is that the gaps between the cells start to grow because the cells shrink, and as you might imagine, it would not be crazy to posit that that might be linked to something called a leaky gut. So what happens when butyrate, when T cells sample that butyrate, bring the antigen back and show it to, the dendritic cells sample it, bring it back, show it to T cells, it activates T regulatory cells. Those were the kind of T cells that quell inflammation. And that basically blocks an inflammatory response. So here we've got all the sort of pieces connected between our diet and the inflammatory response in our bodies, the way our immune system is working. And it's mediated greatly through the role that microbial metabolites play in our gut. Because when we started writing The Hidden Half of Nature, we thought we were writing a book about restoring soil and restoring our yard. And we ended up devoting half of it to the human microbiome. Why? Well, when you look at these two systems, the human gut and the root system rhizosphere of a plant, you realize that they're very similar, but inside out. You take your colon and turn it inside out, it's not all that different from the root system of the plant. Do the opposite, you get kind of the same thing. And this is in terms of how the microbial communities in those organs are actually interacting to promote the health of the host. They're basically assisting with nutrient acquisition. The microbes in the soil are really helping to bring micronutrients and some major nutrients into plants. They also help facilitate nutrient transfer across our colon wall. The role of microbial metabolites in promoting the health of both plants and people has become very clear in the literature in the last few decades. It was more clear earlier in the plant world. The human microbiome world is sort of catching up, and the parallels, when you get into it, are actually quite striking. The other parallels are in terms of immunity and plant defense. I mean, sure, the defense system of our bodies and the defense system of plants are different. After all, we can move around and we take nature inside of us, whereas a plant is stuck outside and can't move around in nature. But the role of microbial communities and their metabolites in supporting plant defense and our own immune systems are actually strikingly parallel when you get into them. So what does this essentially mean for thinking about our relationship to the natural world, sort of the broader issues I advertised at the start of the talk? Well, first of all, it means that we need to think about our microbial crew, or the microbiomes of both plants and people, in terms of protecting, restoring, and cultivating the beneficial microorganisms that are key elements of those communities. And that has clear implications for both medical and agricultural practices, but in case you sort of want to sometime later, whether tonight or tomorrow, you want to convey to somebody what is the really essence of what that crazy guy from Seattle was talking about in terms of all these microbes. We've boiled the book down to 6 words for you, which should be fairly easy to remember, and that's basically mulch your soil inside and out. But for this audience, there's also, I think, another really big implication of the realization of the fundamental role of microbial community ecology in the health of both plants and therefore crops and people. And that is we really need to think about avoiding the routine use of broad spectrum biocides. Because if we basically use a broad spectrum biocide, we're taking out all the beneficial organisms as well as the pests and pathogens. And we've thought about microbes for a little over 100 years now in terms of germ theory, that they're bad. We need to keep them off of us. We need to sanitize our world. And we've been actually learning very recently about the science about how that is very misguided. And that's not to say that antibiotics or even pesticides should never be used. But what is absolutely clear in my mind is that the idea of relying on them as our routine frontline applications in both agriculture and medicine makes absolutely no sense in light of the modern science that has been revealing these intricate and highly evolved relationships between the microbial communities and the health of plants and people.